Hi everyone, welcome back to another individual album review. It's one that I've been working on for quite some time now, and it's another highly anticipated album, possibly the final album by The Weeknd, Hurry Up Tomorrow. And yeah, I know I've said this review is going to be out for a while, and I did eventually live up to that promise, but it is a lot later than I was hoping. But anyway, may as well get into talking about. Well, before I talk about the album, I want to talk a little bit about The Weeknd, and I'll be honest and say that it has been a long ass time since I listened to any of his early mixtapes from the trilogy. I was originally planning on it before I started working on this review, but I don't really remember loving them all that much when I did listen to them a while ago. And I've just been in a big time crunch. This was a while ago that I even listened to his other albums this year. It was probably back in January before this even came out. And I did take the time to listen to those five studio albums, though. If you want some brief thoughts on those, I just think he's more of a singles artist than an album artist, at least for me. Yeah, of course, I love Blinding Lights, and I stand by The Hills being the second best hit song of 2015. And while those are probably my favorites of his big hits, I will also praise In the Night, Heartless, and Starboy, the song. And even some of his deep cuts and lesser known singles are really great. False Alarm got a bit of a weird reception, but I've always really loved that track. Angel is a great closer for Beauty Behind the Madness, and Gasoline was a phenomenal standout on Dawn FM. And if you haven't noticed by now, that is a wide variety of musical styles represented in those songs that I just mentioned, which definitely showcases The Weeknd's ability to experiment with totally different genres and actually pull it off, which is something that a lot of artists fail miserably at. But those are scattered cuts within long, usually hour-long projects, which mostly consist of forgettable tracks which are mildly pleasant at best and kind of insufferable at worst. And he often has a tendency to say things in his lyrics where you just sit there and go, huh, wait, did he actually just say that? And you know what? I'll admit sometimes it works, but it often just feels way too corny and try hard and just completely throws off the vibe of whatever song it is. So, quickly going over each of his studio albums, I don't think Kissland is very good. Beauty Behind the Madness has its moments, but is way too long and inconsistent. Starboy is a hell of a mixed bag. And 2022's Dawn FM, in retrospect, was better than I gave it credit for when I reviewed it on my blog, and I'll call it a good album now, but it's far from a great one. I think the closest any of those five records comes to being great as a full project is 2020's After Hours, an album which I loved at the time when I was discovering my music taste, but listening to it now I would only call it pretty good, and it just lost a lot of its magic for me. Yeah, there are some great moments, but the production, while impressive, was not really my cup of tea, and the songwriting didn't feel all that unique for the majority of the album. And I felt like it was all packaged as being this huge magnum opus, which I don't really think The Weeknd pulled off. But still, it's hard to deny that The Weeknd has been a huge part of pop culture, and I have to at least respect him as an artist, even if I've never really been a huge fan personally. Now, of course, I haven't yet mentioned The Idol, but that's a can of worms that I don't want to open, and by that I mean I've avoided that show because, well, considering the reviews, why would I watch it? So anyway, on the topic of this album, I was really hoping that the final album by The Weeknd would surprise me, and maybe I'd actually really click with a full Weeknd project for once. And I'm gonna go through these track by track, starting with the opening track, which I do feel kind of conflicted on. It's called Wake Me Up, and it sees him working with legendary French electronic duo Justice. And the sound quality is really high, with the synths that feel reminiscent of Dawn FM, but without any of the weird timbres that didn't quite click for me on that album. The percussion does have some nice punch to it here as well, and I like Abel's vocal delivery. And I am, in a lot of ways, very much reminded of the Foles track of the same name, in large part because of the name and the way those words fit over top of the instrumental. Although, I like this track a lot better than that one. Although, with all this being said, I know this is a comparison. I feel like I make a lot more than I want to with music, but I can't help but feel like this just sounds a bit too much like a Bastille track. Especially with lyrics like, "Are you real or are you an illusion?" being made to sound really dramatic, and it doesn't work, even though I do mostly like this track. Where I'm a lot more impressed is the second track, Cry For Me, which has some absolutely killer synthesizers and varied vocal performances throughout the track, both of which keep the tension here while sticking to the main vibe of sadness and frustration that continue throughout the song. Track 3 is literally called I Can't Fucking Sing, which sounds really funny until you realize it's about Abel losing his voice at a show in 2022. And this is just a 12-second interlude, and okay, the song title is still kind of funny, I'll admit. This leads into Sao Paulo. I'm not entirely sure if I pronounced that correctly. I hope I did. I feel like I should know how to pronounce it, considering it's one of the biggest cities in the entire world. But anyway, that track is a collab with Anita, which has been getting quite a bit of attention for its epic beat and those grimy synths, and Anita's really catchy hook. And while it's not one of my absolute favorites, I do still like this track quite a bit, mostly for Anita's chorus. I think the biggest thing holding it back for me is that it runs a little long with some sections of the track not really hitting nearly as hard, and thus I think it could have just been a few minutes shorter and probably would have been better for it. After another short interlude, we get the song Baptized in Fear, a track which I personally am not really a fan of. The darker lyrics just don't really fit with the mostly bright sounding melodies and instrumentation. And on that note, I don't really think the melodies are all that interesting, at least when paired with Abel's weaker than usual vocal delivery on this track, and the whole thing just sounds kind of drab and watered down. But that track does lead nicely into Open Hearts, a track with pulsating synths that pair well with the stiff percussion that still allows some breathing room for the production, with some of the higher pitched synths filling in that space quite sharply. And I like the melodies on this track, although just like the previous track, Abel's vocals here are far from his best. It's still a really good song, but it just feels like it should be a lot better. Opening Night is another track that I think is pretty good, but I just wish there were a bit more to it. I like the idea, describing a relationship between two people who have very different views on it, and the production sounds really good, but it just kind of ends suddenly. I definitely can't say I'm a huge fan, though, of the collab with Florence and the Machine and Travis Scott, that being Reflections Laughing. It sounds kind of like a Kissland era song for the first couple of minutes before Florence Welch provides backing vocals, and then it has a phone call sample in the middle, which makes it a bit more clear that the song is about the effects of fame and trying to save yourself from the negative impacts of that. At least I think that's what it's about. But I just feel like Travis's verse, while not bad, just feels out of place and awkward with the vibe of this track, and it's not even like the Weeknd's part is particularly interesting, although he and Florence do have surprisingly good vocal chemistry. Future appears on the following Enjoy the Show, and I didn't like their collabs on Starboy, and I don't really think it works here either. Although I do like the Weeknd's first verse, where I think he's making fun of the idea of his suffering under the pressure of fame being used as entertainment, and the production on this track is really strong. I just don't really think Future adds much to the track, and I feel like they don't have a lot of chemistry when they collab together. Same reason why I don't really like 6 Feet Under or All I Know. And Future also appears briefly on the next track, Given Up on Me, which doesn't really give me a whole lot to say, but it's a pretty solid slice of a retro sound, not only with the samples of old songs, but somewhat in the Weeknd's vocal performance and the overall vibe. And I Can't Wait to Get There sounds like a Tyler the Creator song, and a really good one. I really like the funky groove with those beautiful synths and a really good chorus from Tommy Parker. I like some of the melodies on Timeless, but Playboi Carti's verse is totally throwaway in my opinion, and there are some weird lines like when The Weeknd says, "If I was you, I would cut up my wrist." And really, this song just doesn't have much to offer in my opinion. It's okay, I guess, but that's about all I'll give it. I'm not a huge fan of Niagara Falls with its pretty bland percussion and synths, which just sound like they don't really go anywhere. But Take Me Back to LA is easily one of the best songs here in my opinion. I mean, just listen to the production on this track. It sounds immaculate, and I love that synthesizer melody which amplifies the bittersweetness of returning to a feeling of familiarity despite not wanting to leave where you are currently. The next track, Big Sleep, is one that I'm not really sure I should try to describe, but it is quite an interesting track and honestly one of my favorites on this album. I love those eerie synths and the phenomenal vocals, which also sound great over top of that synth. It does feel a bit all over the place in a way that would usually bother me, but it's also so dreamlike that totally makes sense. It kind of feels like an interlude, but it's a really damn good one that I think works as a standalone track, whether it was meant to or not. Give Me Mercy is a mostly pleasant track, which feels like a fitting inclusion on the final Weeknd album, where he begs for forgiveness from a higher power who he's discovered a new belief in, after all the sins that have appeared on Weeknd albums since the very beginning. And while I wish the instrumental on this track felt a bit less hollow, the melodies are strong and it's a mostly enjoyable tune with a good vocal performance. The following track is Drive, which I'll admit doesn't really do much for me, with the overpowering snare and a lack of interesting vocal melodies, and a vocal performance which can be a little grating. It's not a bad track, but nowhere near one of my favorites. I do at least like the build at the end, though. The Abyss is next, and it's the fourth to last track on the album. It's yet another collaboration between The Weeknd and Lana Del Rey, and while there are some good melodies and a nice eeriness to the sound, the actual synth and drum timbres and reality don't quite fit in my opinion. And the kick sounds way overemphasized in the mix. Red Terror doesn't give me much to say outside the fact that the end of the track seems to be talking about the end of the Weeknd, as he says, "Call me by the old familiar name." And I just can't help but wonder if that's a theme throughout the track. And don't get me wrong, it's a good song, just not one that feels particularly memorable. Without a Warning feels like it should be an absolutely epic penultimate track with its borderline anthemic chorus. The crowd will scream my name. And I'll admit, the percussion is rock solid, but the synth timbres lead to a bit of a hollow mix, not gonna lie. But then finally, we get the title track, in which The Weeknd embraces the death of that persona, and it's not a track I'd just go out of my way to listen to on its own, but considering the context, I think it's a really powerful way to end the album. And it's the kind of track that really leaves me wondering what Abel is going to do now that he's no longer The Weeknd. So, in conclusion, look, I know this wasn't as in-depth a review as it could have been, but aside from the slow transition towards some kind of a closing statement that happens throughout the album, this is in a lot of ways a typical Weeknd album, I think. Although considering his diversity in musical style, that doesn't really say a whole lot. There are some great tracks on this record, but considering how long it is and how inconsistent it is, I think I'm going to have to give this a 6 out of 10. And look, I've never been the biggest fan of The Weeknd's albums. Again, I usually prefer individual songs of his over the full-length albums. But I also think for the artist that he is, it's a good way to end this journey as The Weeknd. And while you've probably heard this already, if you've taken any interest in his artistry at all, I definitely recommend giving this album a shot if you have not already done so. Alright, so I'm glad this review is finally out. It's currently March 26th as of the time I'm filming this. I actually think I might work on this review, the editing of it today, and hopefully get it posted today. But we'll see if that happens. We'll see if I get around to it. Thank you for watching, as always. And yeah, feel free to let me know in the comment section down below what you thought of this album, or what you thought of the review, or both. Again, I didn't love this record. I think my favorite tracks are definitely Cry For Me, Big Sleep, and Take Me Back to LA. No particular order on those ones. If you want my full list of favorite tracks, you can look in the description down below. It'll show all the other tracks that I liked quite a bit, but those three are definitely my three favorites, the three that I'm probably going to go back to a bit more. But yeah, like, I don't think it's a bad album. It's just really long and it's a lot to take in. But, you know, I gotta say, like, I kind of have to respect the artistry that has come out of this man. Like, he's been an iconic part of pop culture for the past few years. And whether you're a fan of his music or not, and I'm not the biggest fan, I mean, I love certain singles, but I'm definitely not, like, a super fan. But yeah, like, you gotta acknowledge, you know, just the impact that he's had on the pop music landscape. And yeah, I can also acknowledge, like, he's made some killer tracks. I mean, I love Blinding Lights. I love False Alarm. There's a few others as well that I mentioned earlier. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling now. So anyway, just to give a really quick update on future videos. I still haven't been listening to a ton of new music because I mentioned in my last video, one of my ears is not working particularly well right now, which makes it a lot harder to listen to music while doing other things. But I'm still working on some reviews. I got a couple mini reviews in the works right now. Hopefully I'll have another video out shortly. There is another album that I want to review in its own video as well. Actually two. One of them, well, both of them, we'll see if I get around to doing that. But anyway, for now, thank you for watching. I will hopefully be back with more reviews soon.